Welcome along, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me well enough. My name is Jason Weeks, for those of you who don't know me. For those of you who are joining in on the phone call, obviously you would have heard a bit about what's going on tonight. I'll ask all of you, gentlemen, ladies, everybody, to please respect the process. Kate's done a lot of work, especially for tonight, as well as the ongoing work she's already been doing on behalf of the whole community. I think we can do her the favour of listening politely to what she has to say. Please, if you have any questions, jot them down. I'm thinking I'm going to have a few. And once she's finished her presentation, which will take the best part of an hour, then if you've got some questions to ask, we're more than happy to answer them. And of course, if you're watching this online and you would like to ask some questions, please submit them through the various pages and we'll do our best to get an answer from the lady herself. But first of all, obviously, as the process of the GEMAP process is being discussed within the Shire, I think it's important that all of us do our best to be as educated as we possibly can be about what is the process, what the implications are now and maybe in the future, the reasons behind those processes, and of course, how that's going to affect your lifestyle moving forward. Obviously, worst case scenario planning is a very important part of leadership in any role. Any mining company will be planning for their worst disasters they can possibly have, and that makes perfect sense. So from that point of view, I think having some management strategies in place for whatever may happen in the future is a very, very sensible way to go. However, as we'll see from the presentation, there's a bit more going on behind the scenes, and that's where someone like Kate is so amazingly important because of the work and effort that goes into separating all the different pieces of legislation and how they interlace with each other. If you've ever had to go through any of those documents, you'll understand what I'm talking about when I say it can be quite complex. So Kate's done a lot of the hard work. What attracted me to some of her work that I've seen is the fact that she's very methodical in her processes. She cross-references everything. She doesn't just refer to some pie-in-the-sky stuff and expect you to take her word for it. In fact, I think she expects you to go and have a look for yourself. And if you find something that she hasn't uncovered, she's just as interested to hear from you. So it's an information exchange. She doesn't have a dog in the fight as such, except for they're going through similar issues on the East Coast where she is. So I'll welcome to the call, and everyone's been looking forward to hearing from you, Miss Kate Mason.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So Kate, first of all, sorry, I'll just talk straight over the topic here, but just to start us off, just how did you first get interested in finding out more about this process? What sparked your interest?
So it was just January of this year, which feels like a very long time ago, but I was listening to a radio station in New Zealand called Reality Check Radio, and they were talking, there was some women talking about Kapiti, an area in New Zealand, and how they're going under managed retreat disaster adaptation planning for Kapiti. It's the whole area. It didn't differentiate between how far away you were from the ocean, regardless of where you actually lived within Kapiti. They were talking about putting certificates over houses, talking about climate change issues in the future. So this is modelling, climate change modelling in the future, which, you know, potentially or will lead to lower house being, you know, your house value dropping. And I thought I better just see what's happening in Australia, and had a look, and there's a huge amount happening in Australia, and a lot's been rolled out this year. So not a lot of people are aware of it, but there's an enormous amount within government plans and also legislation.
And so as far as the rollout in New Zealand's concerned, did you have a personal involvement in that with friends and family and things, or was it just a news item you picked up?
No, I just know that everything that's happening locally is happening globally. So that was enough to go, I better check Australia, and to realise that globally, all around the world, managed retreat is very firmly on the agenda. So I will explain what managed retreat is. I do want to go through a lot of what I will show you is New South Wales, but that's regardless. It will be in somewhere within your Western Australian legislation or within bodies looking at this over there, because it's Australia-wide as it is globally, being talked about in many, many countries around the world.
So even within, obviously, the management structures, the people we've spoken to so far, not many people seem to be able to put their finger on what managed retreat actually means, as far as at what stage does it kick in, at what level does the implications start to happen. What was the most surprising thing for yourself as far as what sounds like a fairly benign thing?
Well, they're using very high risk modelling. So they're using the most extreme modelling that can be used for climate. So it's all models. So it's all climate change models, but they're using the most highest extreme ranking of the IPCC, 6.5 or 8.5, I think it is. So that, and then they're compiling disasters together to come up with a scoring in New South Wales. So basically, different climate change models are used for different purposes. So you can come up, use one climate change model because they're all different. Use one climate change model to come up with your risk of fire, and use another climate change model to come up for your risk of flooding. But you're still compiling all of those risks together to get a certain score. So it's very risk adverse, basically, from things I've read, and I will show you what I'm reading because I'm not interested in this being my opinion. It's I'll show you the documents, but it's basically anywhere that's near the natural environment is too much of a hazard. There's always risks implicit in living in nature. You can't remove that without removing us from nature. And that's what I'm seeing more and more in these documents. There's no room for that risk. The other thing that is just the amount of corporate partnerships, the amount of private funding for private infrastructure that's on the cards, which is really concerning to me. So I'll show you again how governments are broke. And the answer to that is to have more our infrastructure going into private corporation hands. So not only the infrastructure that's already on the way out, our roads are falling apart, etc. It's not just even that. Now there's going to be huge amounts of disaster infrastructure needing to be implemented, warning infrastructure and different disaster infrastructure. So there's a massive amount need for capital because the governments can't fund it. And this really, really concerns me because I see this as an absolute coup for massive private corporations who are incredibly intrinsically involved with the United Nations. And I'll show you where it all comes down from the United Nations. And there's not enough of this unpacking. So even Resilient Sydney, Resilient Melbourne, who are very much putting out documents, and they've been around, I think since about 2015, they're funded by Rockefeller. This was all set up by the Rockefeller Foundation. And if anyone has any history, you'll know that Rockefeller Foundation has enormous power globally.
And again, the more you scratch the surface and go down that rabbit hole, it widens up further. And so what then is so I guess probably the best way is to let you lay out the foundation and roll out your presentation, because if we try to jump ahead too many steps, it might create some confusion. But at the end of the day, there's an end road. You mentioned finances. Have you seen anywhere in any of the government documentation, any of the research you've done, have you seen a funding profile that shows how managed retreat would be funded? As far as, does the money exist? Are they allowing for it, or is it just a magical thing?
No, I think it's all getting done at the moment, but in the New South Wales state plan, it does reference helping people, because they're talking about widespread managed retreat through New South Wales, and that policy will be out next year. But it talks about, potentially private corporations could help fund managed retreat and then get the land and the resources in return. It blatantly says that.
Yeah, and so anything agreed upon to be an environmental or a sustainable business, which tag word are they using for the types of businesses?
They're not even saying that in that one, but then I will talk about what I think will happen to the land with this natural assets and etc. The nature repair market and the 30 by 30, 2030. What I'm thinking and seeing is that just more and more assets, including our nature, will go into private hands.
And I guess before I let you launch into it, is this something we should be despondent about? Is there action able to be done? Is it too late, or is it time for people to put on their marching shoes and make a bit of noise?
Well, I mean, in New South Wales, they're rolling out. So at the moment, the New South Wales government has just closed a consultation, but they're going to put the disaster adaptation plans down into local council. And so the local councils will be enacting these disaster adaptation plans, which is different to the coastal, what's it called, the coastal management plans. It's different to that. So coastal management plans in New South Wales have managed retreat on the agenda as well. But this is where they'll be looking at all the infrastructure costs. And I do want to talk about this because when they bring in all this disaster adaptation costs, infrastructure, we're going to be paying for it. So it's going to be increased costs. So I do want to go through my presentation about a perfect storm that's basically coming for private home ownership as I see it. Yes, so I think we have to push back. If you're concerned, I mean, I'm not really interested in trying to convince anyone to be concerned. It's up to individual people as to whether or not they're concerned about this and the ramifications. But if you are concerned, I do think the local council level is where people are going to need to push back and be really on the ball. So I just want to give people enough of the wording, enough of the language, enough of the arena that we're in so they can recognise it.
Absolutely fantastic. Who wants to see the presentation? Pretty keen? Yeah. Thanks for that, Kate. I'll be quiet and leave you to it.
This actually shouldn't even be done by me. So this is what's also I'd like to frame this as. Why isn't the local state minister or your federal minister representing your area talking about managed retreat and what it means? This should all be just laid out in a transparent manner, yet I would say the vast majority of Australians don't even know managed retreat is on the agenda to the extent it is. So that's a question as to why is this sort of being done covertly. Okay, so managed retreat involves the purposeful, coordinated movement of people and buildings away from risks. This may involve the movement of a person, infrastructure, so buildings and roads, or communities. It can occur in response to a variety of hazards, and it's politicians, insurers and residents are increasingly paying attention to managed retreat from low-lying coastal areas because of the threat of sea level rise due to climate change. So trends in climate change predict, and it's all predictions. This is really important that people understand that. Substantial sea level rises worldwide, causing damage to human infrastructure through coastal erosion and putting communities at risk of severe coastal flooding. So I just want you to note that it talks about, so moving people, it's before a disaster happens. It's preemptive, it's not after a disaster happens. And just note that it talks about infrastructure being moved as well, because I think that's really key. So is the world ready for mass migration due to climate change? This is a BBC article, with up to 3 billion people expected to be displaced by the effects of global warming by the end of the century. So we're not talking small scale here. This is their estimates. Globally, there is an emerging roadmap for generating community acceptance of planned relocation as part of building a city's climate resilience. And I will end with talking a little bit, if I can get to it, with where I think this is heading in terms of movement into cities. The limited experience of cities that have taken on planned relocation suggests that an effective process depends on critical actions that move the community from denial and anger to acceptance. It's especially important to reframe relocation as not simply a loss of what was, but as part of a larger and inspiring vision for what can be for the city's future. So there's a need to create some social license and get people okay with being moved due to climate change modelling. And this is just one example. This is in Wales. So I've got a number of videos on YouTube, and it's just Kate Mason YouTube. And I've unpacked, some of the state plans and the legislation, but somebody put this comment on about Fairborn in Wales. Was built on this is what she said. It was built on a salt marsh in the 1850s. It's below sea level at spring tides and has some sea defences. Local comments from that area include that their homes have never been flooded. Any flooding of the surrounding area comes from the hillside rather than the sea, and the flooding's a lot worse at other towns. A computer model has forecast that the sea will rise 4.7 millimetres per year, 1 metre over the next century. The locals don't agree and will stay and see what happens. The chip shop has said they'll keep the fryers on until the sea comes through the door. So that sort of caused me to have a look at this town. So back in 2014, more than 400 houses were expected to be abandoned in the village, so it must be a very small village by 2055 as part of the council's shoreline management plan. And that the authority adopted the plan after accepted it could no longer defend Fairbairn in the long term. It came as a massive shock to the people that lived there. They weren't included at all in the plans, and suddenly to find that out. So basically the council said it wouldn't spend any more money defending Fairbairn against rising sea levels and flood encroachment. So they would have to leave their homes. So, you know, it took a withdrawal of, they were no longer going to update any infrastructure into the town. So this is where the infrastructure becomes really important. There was only a population of 700 people. And they were suggesting the sea levels were rising. In another article, it was talked about the people having to leave through managed retreat would have to pay about £6,000 to be able to vacate. So people themselves are going to have to pay for this managed retreat. And a university geologist, Dr. Graham Hall, modelled alternative outcomes for sea level rise over the next century and has criticised the non-peer reviewed reports used to justify Fairbairn's people having to leave. So this is only recently. So it looks like, so in 2023, so it looks like the modelling hasn't held up and that the council's backing off a bit from that at the moment. But they were talking about 10-year process where the people thought they were going to have to leave and were fighting it, to it being actually pulled back because the modelling wasn't right. And this is what's happening in Kapiti as well in New Zealand, is that people are questioning the modelling and the report that's come out from a private corporation that was paid to do the plan for Kapiti. They're questioning a lot of things and inaccuracies within the report. And that's also really important that people have, if you're concerned, that you actually do look at the modelling that's being used and also what the reports are saying about your town. Okay, so sea level rise, managing retreat for sandy beach areas under sea level rise is projected to impact approximately 1 billion people by 2100. And the most viable long-term option is managed retreat. There's a growing consensus that retreat will become an increasingly important strategy. Now we come to Rockefeller Foundation, and because what they've done is they've changed the terminology. So resilience is really important to understand what they mean by resilience. So it's changed, and this is for Australia as well. So it moves away from traditional disaster risk management, which is founded on risk assessments that relate to specific hazards. So you might think there's a specific hazard and you have a risk assessment to it. Instead, it accepts the possibility, so it's only the possibility, that a wide range of disruptive events, both stresses and shocks, may occur, but are not necessarily predictable. And then resilience focuses on enhancing the performance of a system in the face of multiple hazards, rather than preventing or mitigating the loss of assets due to specific events. So we're moving into territory where you could actually have a more concrete understanding of a disaster and a risk, to something where there's a lot of things compiled and it may or may not happen and it's impossible to know. And it's not predictable. Okay, so this comes from some of the reports. I haven't tracked it all right back and when it started at the United Nations, but the SENDI framework was in 2015. Countries, and Australia's a member country of the United Nations. Member states, including Australia, agreed on the SENDI framework for disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030, the global blueprint for building the world's disaster resilience. It was adopted alongside the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015, and that was when the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were identified and agreed upon, and you would have them most likely in your council because everyone now has to reference everything according to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sendai framework guides Australia's approach to disaster risk reduction. Now, just to say here, I have enormous concerns about the United Nations because they're completely embedded with massive global corporate entities, and even just, I mean, for their whole history. But if we just talk about in 2019, the United Nations signed a strategic partnership with the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum is the 1,000 largest global corporate entities in the world. So there's corporate entities embedded completely in what's happening. So the present framework, this is the Sendai framework, small scale and large scale, frequent and infrequent, sudden and slow onset disasters caused by natural or man-made hazards, as well as related environmental, technological and biological hazards and risks. And so it's this multi-hazard management of disaster risk. And this needs to be address underlying disaster risk factors through disaster risk informed public and private investments is more cost effective than relying on post-disaster response. So it's all preemptive, and you can see that private investments is in there as well as public. So the development, strengthening and implementation of relevant policies, plans, practices and mechanisms needs to aim at coherence as appropriate across sustainable development and growth, climate change, health, food security, environmental management and disaster risk reduction agendas. So this is the Sendai framework coming down into our our government plans. So the United Nations also has put out that every person in the world needs to be involved or be integrated into an integrated system of hazard monitoring, forecasting and prediction, disaster risk assessment, communication, preparedness activities, systems and processes that allow individuals, communities, governments, businesses and others to take timely action to reduce disaster risks in advance of hazardous events. And early warnings and action save lives. To that end, today I announce the United Nations will spearhead new action to ensure every person on Earth is protected by early warning systems within 5 years. So I'll go to Australia, New South Wales. In 2022 in New South Wales, the New South Wales Reconstruction Act was passed, and this act allows for preemptive, so before a disaster happens, preemptive disaster measures, as well as the recovery and reconstruction if a disaster happened. So they've got, they're looking at natural disasters, bushfires, coastal hazards, cyclones, earthquakes, floods, heat waves, landslides, severe thunderstorms, tornadoes and tsunamis, and then hazards caused by natural disasters, including air pollution, water and soil contamination, and water insecurity. So water is really important in all of this. So it also comes down to whether or not a place has water insecurity. And there's lots of reasons why areas are having water insecurity that are concerning. So, and there's other emergencies in relation to which the minister has requested assistance from the authority. So it can be anything, any emergency that the minister says is an emergency. The authority has the powers of an individual to enter into contracts, acquire, hold, deal with and dispose of property, appoint agents and attorneys and engage consultants, and do anything else necessary or convenient. So they've got a blank check. And they direct council. So the authority, New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, directs local council. The minister may declare a part of the state to be a disaster prevention area. And once that is done, so it's whether or not the minister is satisfied the part of the state is likely to be directly or indirectly affected by a disaster. And so just this minister has to be satisfied about that. And then once they do that, they call it an emergency area for the state, and that declaration remains in force for the period specified in the order. And in exercising its functions, the authority may work in cooperation with other government agents and other persons and bodies the authority thinks appropriate, whether or not the agencies, persons or bodies are in or of the state. So they can work with whoever they want to. Sounds to me like globally. They can, so then they can acquire the land. So once they've done this, said, okay, you're in a disaster prevention area and you might be affected, you're potentially going to be affected or secondarily be affected from some disaster, the authority can then acquire your land by agreement or by compulsory process. So they can buy it, they can take it from you and under the land acquisition. They can manage the land. So they can manage, so just say it's your house, they then have control over your house. They can demolish your house or arrange for it to be demolished. They can subdivide and re-subdivide land. And what else can they do? They can sell it. So I think it's on the next one. So they can then sell, lease, exchange, or otherwise deal with or dispose of land vested in the authority. So it's an enormous amount of power, which I don't think many New South Wales people even knew that act was passed. So just earlier this year, I think it was February, the State Disaster Mitigation Plan came out, and it says things such as, there is often little we can do about the hazard itself. Disaster risk can be reduced by limiting the exposure of people, homes, and infrastructure to hazards or increasing their resilience. So there's not the little they can do about that we live in a natural environment, but they can limit the exposure of people and homes and infrastructure to hazards. And they're tools to reduce exposure and tools to reduce vulnerability. You've got all the mitigation infrastructure and strategic planning controls, warning systems, nature-based measures, which I'll talk about, infrastructure resilience, home modification, which I'll also talk about, and managed relocation, managed retreat. And they talk about they need to have a state policy for large-scale multi-hazard managed relocation. So again, it's large scale for New South Wales. It's going to come out next year, their policy around this, but it's multi-hazard. It's compounding all the hazards that could potentially happen in your area and putting them all together at the most highest risk scenario that they can come up with. They're going to engage the private sector and regulator to develop an approach to prioritise and coordinate place-based infrastructure resilience interventions by private sector operators. And I will talk more about infrastructure a little bit later because I think it's key. And then they're going to do this nature-based measures. So I'll also show you that where it's talked about that nature is now considered infrastructure. So establish a nature-based measures knowledge hub because there's markets within all of this. So they're using a 2060 high emissions climate change scenario. And they say, but they also compound it with population growth. So where I am on the Central Coast in New South Wales, we're going to have a lot of population growth. So we're seen as the #1 most at risk local government area in the whole of New South Wales. So they compile population growth with their extreme climate models to come up with the number as to why the Central Coast is the most serious. And again, they're talking about sea level rise and changes to rainfall runoff and extreme weather events. In the 6th assessment report, the IPCC has said its best estimate for the year 2030 is a global sea level rise of 18 centimetres, although it could be as low as 8 centimetres or as high as 29 centimetres. These predictions demonstrate the ongoing nature of coastal hazard risk. So there's no clear understanding of this, it's modelling. And there's been a lot of things that the models have been wrong about up till now. So they're giving themselves a lot of leeway. The other issue with this modelling is it means there's no end game. It means that you can't just know that something's going to change a certain way. It's sort of an open slather for things to constantly be able to change and shift. And the landscape that we live in we don't have any assurance of even having private home ownership. So this is just how they've ranked it. And you can see that the Central Coast is the #1 most at risk local government area in New South Wales. So they talk about risk reduction is going to have significant upfront costs, such as substantial investment in mitigation infrastructure and upgrades to critical infrastructure to increase its resilience. And sometimes the benefits of risk reduction and adaptation are clear only after a disaster has occurred. Benefits can also, I'm just seeing if there's anything else I want to read in here. Okay, one of the key tools to reduce risk is to change how and where we live through strategic land use planning. So there's places that are just suddenly just, you know, one day they're getting their land is changing to flood zones, projected flooding area. So they're not just talking about not in the future building in certain lands, they're talking about also people who already live on lands. The managed relocation of people from homes in high-risk areas can be disruptive and traumatic. So they acknowledge that it's disruptive and traumatic to move people out of their homes. They go on to talk in this report or another, there's another report, I think it's the New South Wales State Plan as well. They talk about moving communities together because communities are so important to each other. You move them together, which implies that people are being moved into a specified place. And that will be a disaster resilient area, which I will talk to at the end of this presentation. There's issues with insurance. So I'll show you what they're talking about with insurance. Insurance is going to become so costly and prohibitive for many people. It's already 12% of households experiencing insurance affordability stress, but this is going to increase. And this is the clanger. There may be potential opportunities to leverage private sector funding to assist in managed relocation, and for example, using potential planning mechanisms such as transferable development rights to provide incentive for intervention by the private sector. And this is explored this further from a coastal managed relocation perspective, but it could be done in a flood context. Okay, so Defending Sydney is just, I'll quickly go through this report, a little bit of it. They're talking in this report, so this is the Committee for Sydney. It's the insurance conglomerate IAG. It's a infrastructure company from Canada. They partner with Resilience Sydney, which I've said was Rockefeller funded. And they're talking about a planning certificate needing to be put on people's houses. So the full hazards of what's potentially going to happen through projected climate change influences should be on people's properties. And I think this is definitely going to happen. And then it talks about Ausgrid looking at a decision-making framework to guide a forward-looking long-term perspective on responding to the risks presented by climate change and provides the basis for developing and justifying non-network and network investment decisions. And I will go on to explain, but I think one of the ways this is all going to roll itself out is that because of the amount of money that's going to be needed for the disaster infrastructure, and also with what they're talking about with cybersecurity and all the other risks that are present in every document you read about how we're just in an era of rolling crises, I think it's going to be hard to get private corporations to fund small coastal towns. Or the cost will be so prohibitive for the people living there. They want to update quarterly rates notifications to include all hazard exposures and identify sources of further information about risk to life and property in each location. So quarterly, all hazard exposure, update the certificates on the homes to include all hazard exposure and how global warming is expected to exacerbate or change these hazards. So I think one of the first documents I came across when I started to look was this report. It was on the World Economic Forum, but it's an Australian report, Climate Council of Australia, Uninsurable Nation, Australia's most climate vulnerable areas. And they're saying 1 in every 25 will be high risk. 1 in every 25 properties in Australia will be high risk and uninsurable. And 9% of properties, 1 in 11, will reach medium risk classification by 2030 with annual, and with this medium risk, it means that you're underinsured. And then they again talk about an urgent need to upscale investment in national adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So in New South Wales, local council, it's going through, I won't talk about this much more, but the New South Wales government's going to roll this down into local governments to come up with disaster adaptation planning. But the Reconstruction Authority will develop the disaster adaptation plans as far as I can see, and the councils will probably just adopt it. And I've got a Substack, so I've unpacked a lot of this. It's just Kate Mason on Substack, but I've just put their managed retreat adaptation plans. I've just tried to pull out as many things as I can. And these new set of guidelines will assist councils to develop localised disaster adaptation plans. They will guide government, private sector and philanthropic investment decisions in disaster mitigation. So we've got government, private sector and philanthropic investment decisions are going to be how disaster is mitigated. And philanthropic, in case you're not aware, is just very much often, I'm not saying 100% of the time, a guise for private corporations to make profits still under a philanthropic label, and also to be able to influence policy.
Tax-free.
Yep, tax-free. They get massive kickbacks. Okay, so I want to talk about infrastructure and globally. I will just whiz through this because I just want to show you it's not just Australia. United Nations, Rockefeller Foundation and others team up together to build urban resilience. There was the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, a United Nations initiative, financing for development, and Australia was part of this. So they're talking about strengthening public policies, so all the government policies and finance at all levels, unlocking the transformative potential of people and the private sector, and incentivizing changes in financing as well as consumption and production patterns to support sustainable development. So there's always this thing, the United Nations is coming down with their, corporate partnerships, and they're telling government how to, change legislation and put things into policy. It's basically all our government is doing, because I have read many government plans, and you can always find the master plan at the United Nations. Establishing a new forum to bridge the infrastructure gap, investing in sustainable and resilient infrastructure to bridge the global infrastructure gap, including the $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion annual gap in developing countries. So this infrastructure gap is enormous. How blended finance. So the government talks about innovative financing. If you just look for innovative financing or transform, no, they don't call it, it's always innovative and this blended financing. So this is the G20, and the G20 Australia is part of, and this was how blended finance can reorient cautious private investors to infrastructure. After decades of private sector growth, private capital holds most available global finance. The rise of private wealth coincided, strangely enough, with the decline of public wealth in developed countries, which now hold zero or even negative shares in total wealth due to significant public debt burdens, i.e. our governments are broke because all the money's gone into the private sector's hands. So global public debt reached 90% of GDP in 2022, which was spurred along very much by the pandemic measures, a dramatic increase from the 30% recorded in the early 1970s. So against that backdrop, because governments are broke, private capital mobilisation has taken centre stage as a solution to bridge the infrastructure financing gap of around $3 trillion a year. And so again, mobilise private capital. And to do this, governments are seeking to take things even further, calling for innovative and scalable blended finance approaches, including de-risking instruments and solutions that most effectively use limited public funds to maximise private capital investments. So we're paying for private capital investments, which and it's got to be de-risked for those companies to take it on. So it's the government's being very nice to private corporations. Okay, so just quickly, this is the UNDRR, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, making risk-informed decisions on infrastructure investments. principles for resilient infrastructure. And I won't read this out, but there's been many, reports coming through. There's many reports coming through and through COP26 about the increasing urgency for action. And so if mobilised, infrastructure investments would not only replace ageing infrastructure, but also establish new and much needed infrastructure systems. So we're talking about ageing infrastructure as well. We're talking about our roads. We're talking about things that used to be in public, or so far are in public hands. And they assist the public and private sectors in making risk-informed policy and investment decisions, and attracting funds from the private sector. And that's, you just read that over and over again. People are going to have to pay a lot more, e.g. via taxes for resilient infrastructure. And there's going to need to be continuous improvement. So it's not just that you can live in a place and think, okay, I can handle it for a little while. It's continuous improvements. The modelling can be geared up however it wants to be, and you'll be paying more and more for additional infrastructure upkeep. So we've got the road. This is an interesting, if you want to go and have a look more on the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, they've got a lot of reports on there. They've got one about bushfire where they're talking about no longer trying to mitigate bushfires, but more just that people are prepared to leave. So we also need to look at all with this climate change modelling, what's the difference? Does the government start to have different policies around how they manage risks within the natural environment, and then how that leads to people having more potential disaster, because that's another part of it that's not talked about very much. So they want nature positive solutions for infrastructure, focusing on coastal and marine ecosystems, coastal communities, ports and offshore, nearshore renewable energy. So this nature positive solutions I'll come to. We've got the disaster risk reduction in Australia, and just that factors, climate resilient infrastructure and planning frameworks, and digital connectivity and infrastructure. So I won't talk about the digital infrastructure that's coming through, but it's a massive part of it. Then we've got the CSIRO, the Enabling Resilience Investment Framework. And now I want to just go on to the local government. So this is New South Wales, but it would be very similar. This is their submission into the inquiry into the ability of local governments to fund infrastructure and services. Most councils are reporting a deterioration in their financial position, and many fear that they are financially unsustainable or are approaching unsustainability. And this is more in the smaller rural and regional areas who are more vulnerable. So in New South Wales, 54 out of 128 councils are recording a deficit. So they want, in New South Wales, flexibility in being able to charge more for people living in the council area. And that, they just make the thing that council's no longer just about rates and rubbish, roads, rates and rubbish, but now has to, more and more has been forced onto local council and taken out of, state and federal hands and put onto local council without being given any extra or enough money to be able to do all the services they've been tasked with. So they want to be able to charge a lot more for people to live in the area. And they have to include climate change considerations within this. So part of it is that there's been a total cost shift to councils of $1.36 billion in 21 to 22. So this is where, the different layers of government play their part in putting pressure on down to our local area. Councils are often involved at the front lines of disaster recovery and restoration. Adequate levels of asset renewals are an important lever for safeguarding against future environmental disasters and other shocks. So they're talking about the infrastructure needed and the assets. And this financial constraints limit a council's capacity to prepare for and respond to natural disasters. So then we get to this article, at the edge of the cliff, planning for Australia's ageing infrastructure. Many councils don't have the funds to jump on repairing things. They need to program the work where the funds are available. And they're talking, you know, water, sewerage, infrastructure. It was built in the 1970s. The roads are pretty bad now. I don't know if they are where you are, but ours are all full of potholes. So we're reaching an infrastructure cliff. Risks associated with aging infrastructure are compounded by the pressure caused by Australia's ever-growing population and the impact of increasingly frequent weather events. And so we've got the Infrastructure Australia Amendment Act went through in 2023, and this allows the Infrastructure Australia to identify any impediments to investment in nationally significant infrastructure and identify strategies to remove these impediments. Infrastructure Australia. The environment in which infrastructure is planned, delivered and operated has changed significantly over time. So climate change, extreme weather events, global availability of resources and materials, and changing movement patterns, which is, you know, people coming into the country and moving around the country, can create an environment of risk and uncertainty. And this is all about needing this sort of infrastructure for the climate change modelling. So I think I'll just skip through it a bit. I just want to show you that it's in the plans, that this aging assets is constantly talked about, and then the principles for innovative financing by the Australian government, critical transport infrastructure. Yeah, so this is more talking about critical transport, but it's also more with, you know, it's broader than this. This will require active partnerships with state and local governments and the private sector. Now we've just to show what's happening. There's a video, there's an interview I've got on my Substack with Larry Fink, who is the CEO and the founder of BlackRock, who has $13 trillion in assets under management. So they've just bought Global Infrastructure Partners for $12.5 billion. And he says, Larry Fink, the global need for infrastructure combined with high deficits constraining government spending creates unprecedented opportunity for private capital to invest in infrastructure. And there's a video where he talks about that for 7 minutes. Governments are broke and private corporations are going to take over infrastructure. Yep, so again, globally, the need for infrastructure investment is forecast to reach US $94 trillion by 2040. And then a further USD dollars 3.5 trillion will be required to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for electricity and water. So we're going to be paying for this. Yeah, we're going to be paying for it. So again, it's just all about, this is a pathway to infrastructure resilience, which just talks about, you know, how we're going to go into more, you know, extreme times. And they need to improve the infrastructure investment decision-making and value blue and green infrastructure, which I'll come to. Just everything is a shock and a stress, the way they're talking about everything. There's cyber attacks, there's disease, there's pandemics, there's bushfires, extreme weather, water crisis, financial institution failures. And then you've got the aged infrastructure, which, you know, stresses all of this out more, all of these shocks, climate change, drought, etc. And they're using pretty much the resilience that I told you that Rockefeller put out earlier on. Traditional risk management relies on the ability to quantify the likelihood and the impact of disruption on an asset, but now they're moving to compounding shocks and stresses and looking at it in this particular way. There are many parts, so they talk about now how infrastructure is a shared responsibility rather than individual, and it's a responsibility for all at all levels. Okay, so I'll just skip over this. So there's just lots of ways that infrastructure is being discussed in a different way that needs unpacking. I haven't quite got my head around it because they're talking about a system-based approach. Focus on the network of assets and across sectors in addition to the resilience of the assets themselves. So just to know that the framing has changed of what is resilience. And they're going to invest in natural assets that provide services and outcomes that build resilience, such as ecosystem services and well-being. So what this means is they are looking at, I mean, trees, you know, like there's a reality of this. Trees and a natural environment, you know, cools down the place you're living in. It offers absolute benefits. You know, it's lovely to live around nature. It's wonderful. But they want to put a price on that. And then there's going to lead to investment, private investment in that. So where I see this heading is that as you are tasked with moving, you know, told to move out of your house and your land, it can go to, you know, so private interests can get involved in creating markets off the nature you know, rewild it and the nature that's on that land. They can create private markets on this and start to trade in this. So they also get some, not only do they potentially, you know, we're being moved somewhere, but the land itself can be commodified basically. And they talk about the local government, local government policy context, and they're talking about Resilience Sydney is a collaboration between all the councils of metropolitan Sydney. So again, that's Rockefeller funded. I'll just skip over this, but, you know, they talk about the World Bank's resilience rating system, and the project has conducted a basic climate and disaster risk screening and provides a qualitative estimate of residual risks and a justification for the level of risk. So the whole of Australia is going to go under a model for risks. And this is just this blue and green infrastructure that they're talking about. And they've just passed a nature repair bill, which people can trade in biodiversity credits on land as well. So again, it's a lot to unpack around this. But they also talk, so this ecosystem services is very much like you actually value a piece of land or nature on how much fresh air it gives you, how much pollination service it gives you. So you break it down to nature being a service, and then you put a price on it. And Rockefeller and the International Development Bank tried to, at the end of last year, they made they made a sort of ploy to put ecosystem services on the stock market so they could trade in it. It didn't go through at the end of last year, but it potentially will. And in that literature, in the documents they put out, they said that whoever owns the rights to that nature can determine what happens on that land. They have the rights to what happens on that land. So this is where it can come for our national parks, our state forests, and it's actually owned by somebody else. I actually just want to put on the agenda that I think something that needs to be really understood and looked at is the mining for clean energy metals. So I think this is a huge part of what's potentially going on here, or an overlay of what's going on here. So in Australia, we have the Australian Critical Minerals Prospectus, and the Australian government is committed to fast-tracking the exploration, extraction, processing and value adding of critical minerals, and is actively supporting the development of projects across Australia. So critical minerals are essential components of the fourth industrial revolution. So transformative technologies such as all the electrification that needs to happen, hydrogen, electrolyzers, solar panels, wind turbines, greener buildings and batteries that will drive Australia's ambitions to become a renewable energy superpower. So there needs to be a lot of mining to bring up these critical minerals. And they're also crucial to the defence, technology and medical sectors. So this is a map in that plan of Australia and where there are critical mineral mining currently. But they want to increase support to finance mining and processing projects and invest in international partnerships. And Australia continues to be the most attractive region globally for mining investment. And it's ranked first in the world for financial freedom and third for trade freedom. So it's very easy to trade with us and take our natural resources. So Australia spent 4 million, is that 4 million? 4,000, don't know what that says. On mineral export. Yeah, on So an increase of 13% from 2021 to 2022. And this was minor minerals, including lithium, rare earth elements, which all increased. And they say here, while with most of the Australian continent is underexplored, many potential resources remain undiscovered. So they are setting us up to absolutely mine, hugely mine Australia for this. Now, if you come back to this report, you know, because everyone's, you know, up in arms about coal mining, but what about the critical mineral mining, which is going to be enormous? And it's, you know, this report, how does the environmental impact of mining for clean energy metals compare to mining for coal, oil and gas? Because this is seen as part of the clean energy transition, it's okay to do this. It's not going to get the same amount of scrutiny. So the argument could be made that with the clean energy transition, we're exchanging a fossil fuel-based energy system with a metals-based energy system, which is true, and that there is an enormous amount of resource extraction. So they say in this article, even though they're pro this mining, they're saying when one factors in the percentage of material extracted from a mine that is actually the usable resource we want. For coal, this number can range from less than 40 to as high as 90%. So that's the percentage of material extracted from a mine, 40 to 90. In contrast, this number for a copper deposit may be less than 1%, meaning that much more material needs to be extracted and processed for the same volume of output. So we're looking at enormous amounts of mining to get anywhere near what coal would. Okay, so then the US and Australia have created a partnership. So we're going to give our critical minerals to the United States. And this was only 2 days ago, but this was signed, I think, last year, and now it's just getting closer now to happening. So it means that Australia and US critical mineral businesses may now approach the US EFA or EXLIM, and receive streamlined access to both agencies' financing support. This gives a potential borrower the ability to have a joint commitment from any entity, both of our entities. It gives us an ability to collaborate on any number of projects up to our own in each capacity. So there's a lot of free money, available money coming. Now, I'm just going to get to, this is the report of the expert working group on managed retreat for New Zealand. I think this is for the Kapiti area, or it might be just the whole of New Zealand. So they've got a plan in circumstances of deep uncertainty. So there doesn't have to be any certainty of what's going to happen to a particular town. And they say because the financial and social costs of implementing planned relocation are significant, it was thought of as a last resort, but this needs to change. It needs to change because of the inevitable effects of climate change, and early investment in temporary measures will be too expensive. So why, you know, try to do the mitigation and adaptation? You should just be looking more at potentially at the managed retreat side of things. It's so adaptation planning is anticipating, it anticipates for plans and plans for changes. So there's all different types of futures that could happen. It's all uncertain. And so one of the things that they'll do potentially is say, okay, well, you can stay in the area until a certain trigger thing is reached. So it could be 50% of people in the town can no longer afford insurance. That might trigger a managed retreat. I don't know. It hasn't been fleshed out yet, but I think that's potentially things that can happen. When they talk about community, because, you know, not many people, like the Kapiti people, didn't even know about it. They just caught wind of it. They already had certificates overlaid over their homes saying the projected climate change risks, and they didn't even know until somebody found it out. Somebody came into the area to live in the area, found it out. And then they had to work very hard to know that there was any community consultation on. And then they did their own letterbox dropping, and over 100 or 200 community members turned up. Before that, there was like 5 or 6 people in the meetings because no one knew about it. So this is what happens. So in this report, they talk about the problems of community consultation. And they talk about another problem that has arisen in overseas planned relocations is that community engagement can be captured by privileged or powerful voices within the community. For example, well-resourced property owners. So they have to mitigate this. There's a risk when somebody is actually well-resourced and comes into a community meeting and doesn't want to go along with what's being planned. So the authorities can mitigate this risk by carefully planning community engagement at national for meaningful and genuine engagement with communities. So and instantly that rings my alarm bells that they're putting somebody who's coming in who's well-resourced as a threat, and that there's going to be meaningful and genuine engagement with communities. I have been trying to communicate and communicate to government for the better part of last 2 or 3 years, and I never see that they do genuine and meaningful community engagement. And that's my background in community engagement. So they talk about the community is not the ultimate decision maker. Decisions will be made on behalf of the community. Community panels will help provide rounded feedback rather than individually focused feedback. So you'll be managed through a particular process to come to a particular outcome. And they want only very limited rights to appeal to the courts. So you can't really go to the court because they don't want this whole thing slowed down by court, by people taking them to court. So this is to avoid lengthy delays. So they just want it to be everyone that tries to get up in arms and do a court case, they just bounced in and out really quickly so you can get through this as quickly as possible. So that in their plans, they say holiday, if you've got a holiday or a second home and it's under managed retreat, you'll receive no compensation. So if you've got your primary house, that you'll keep that, but you will receive no compensation for a secondary and they do not seek to preserve existing wealth or asset values. That's not important. And the proposal, so they will include some assistance, this proposal, for relocation, demolition or similar costs. With the holiday home, I'm pretty sure in this report it said something like people actually have to pay to destroy their own holiday homes, or if they've got a second home. Now, this is just, I am getting close to finishing, but this is another thing that's coming in. So we have a bit of a perfect storm happening. We've got the managed retreat, we've got the disaster infrastructure, which is going to become very costly, and that's going to come in the next few years. We've got local councils who can't pay for it, so it's going to pass over into private corporation hands. So they're going, they don't do that for free. So we're going to be paying more and more to live where we want to live. The rates are going to go up because the councils are broke. So you've got rates going up for council, you've got the disaster infrastructure, you've got potentially the managed retreat relocation to somewhere more resilient. Then you've got this. So they have changed it now to expanding the nationwide housing energy rating scheme. So this was for new builds. Now it's for any existing home. Implement larger scheme reforms necessary to underpin the home energy rating disclosure framework with timing dependent on decisions. So people's homes will have to have these star ratings like you've got on your fridge. They'll have to have that on there. And so then you cannot rent it out unless it comes to a certain star, but it's also going to be very hard to sell your house if you don't have it up to the energy rating. So there's going to be increased cost for households to update their homes to get into this energy infrastructure. And this again can change as well. So this, I didn't put much in here. I've got to explore this more. But basically, this will change as well. This will get more and more stringent. But they're talking about double glazing windows. They're talking about changing, what's in the ceiling, what's the cladding on the walls. It's going to be incredibly costly to do it. So there's a number of areas that are coming together that are going to make private home ownership very, very difficult. The other thing is the rising insurance that's affecting a lot of homeowners already. So about 5 or 6 things are about to come together in a perfect storm. Do you want me to finish here, or do you want me to say where I think they're going to move people to?
What do you guys want? A bit of projection? I don't know anyone who's spent as much time looking at this as you have, Kate, so I'd love to hear what you think it's going.
Okay, it's only another 6 or 7 minutes, but we are living in an era of rolling risks, and they all talk about it. So this is the risk. As more people and assets become rapidly concentrated in cities, and as infrastructure struggles to keep up with rapid growth, The risk from so you're not safe in cities either. The risk from natural disasters and climate change is rising. Disaster management. So this gets into the smart cities, the disaster management in smart cities. Living in a secure and resilient city with smart city critical infrastructure means that citizens can feel secure in being provided with essential services. So you're getting into this smart infrastructure, which is the disaster resilience infrastructure in smart cities. And smart cities and rapid urbanization are transforming the planet and the way we live. Around 3 million people move into the urban environment every week. And by 2050, cities are expected to have additional 2.5 billion residents. So smart sustainable cities and communities comes under Sustainable Development Goal number 11. And you have to rescue Sustainable Development Goal 11 for a resilient urban planet. Humanity's present and future is urban. Now is the time to think, plan, and act urban. And the response capacity of local and regional governments to crises and threats shapes impacts globally. So yeah, there's going to be climate, biodiversity emergence, violence, armed conflicts, cyber attacks, inflationary pressures, displacement, and other natural and human-caused disasters manifest most acutely in cities and force local governments to the forefront of the response. So they need all this digitalized infrastructure and then all the safety around this as well. And they need to be at the forefront of climate action. Unlocking stranded urban resources is a major opportunity to finance the SDGs. So I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it sounds like it's selling off urban resources. I'll just go on. There's a lot of, Australia's got the new urban, the urban plan that comes from the United Nations. So that's worth having a look at. I didn't put the new urban agenda. We've got the same thing, just came out last year, I think, or this year for Australia. And urban areas need to be prepared for dynamic and unpredictable futures. So there's going to need to be a huge amount of infrastructure. And then they talk about the 15-minute city concept as a model, because with all these disasters, everyone needs everything within a 15-minute walk. And yeah, so shock resilience, and that they are roadmaps. So this is Australia's National Urban Policies, SDG 11, and it facilitates a national lift in the quality. No, where is it? It's an opportunity to plan for and create future-proofed, adaptive and urban environments in the face of change and uncertainty. They need to prepare for and adapt to the anticipated structural changes that will shape urban economies, industries, and settlement patterns, so where we live. And the private sector plays an important role in the way our cities are developed, influencing the built environment and contributing to the growth and sustainability of our urban places. So all the public-private partnerships. My city is getting ready, is yours. We're a global partnership to strengthen local resilience. And again, post-disaster recovery, it's the building back better around disaster risk. And this is just about how the United Nations is very involved in local council level to enhance collaboration among people at the local level. So you've got ICLEI, which is where the United Nations and local governments work together. So I don't know if you've got ICLEI on your local council. You've got the Resilient Cities Network, again, which is Rockefeller in partnership with World Economic Forum. You've got the C40 cities, which is a lot of the mayors in Australia are signed up to the C40. And this is where this goes global to local. So I'm just going to get out of this. Okay, so where I see this going is if you look at how much disaster and risk they're talking about, and then you think, okay, well, it's going to go into private corporations' hands for infrastructure. And then there's going to need to be not only just looking after our aging infrastructure, but then huge amounts of disaster infrastructure. Are the private corporations going to fund a small town and keep the infrastructure going in a small town? Or are they going to say it's not worth it? It's not worth it to keep infrastructure in this town? Or if it is worth it to keep it in this town, how much of the people who are going to live there have to pay for it? And therefore, will only the very, very wealthy live in, you know, beautiful areas like the area you live in. So I think infrastructure is really key to what's going to happen.
Well, I guess, Kate, it makes sense now why Perth foreshore is not going to experience a water level rise, even though we are, because that's urban. So our Lord Mayor of the City of Perth has just announced a plan to spend over $1 billion on the Swan River foreshore. And I don't know if you're aware of the geography of our capital city, but the Swan River is connected to the Indian Ocean, which is, you know, so it's going to have a similar effect on the foreshore of Perth. But that's an urban area, so everyone should be okay. I was a bit concerned to hear about the carefully managed public consultation aspect. It's interesting just to read the language that's being promulgated from on high. And I think you've sort of nailed it and obviously the documents you reference have nailed it by suggesting that the local governments are being thrust into this situation where we're being expected to tell you guys that this stuff's all okay and we just got to do it, and let's just, you know, let's not rock the boat. I guess there's some concerning things about the SDGs, obviously, in the Paris Agreement itself. I think if people even understood the fact that every country was just allowed to write whatever they wanted. China said, we will reduce the amount by which we increase our carbon dioxide output each year. That was their Paris Agreement. Australia went, oh, we're going to bend over backwards and we're going to do everything and reinvent everything and give away everyone's stuff to be the best on the block, get the biggest green tick. How direct do you feel the involvement's been on an external level with Australian politics as far as UN's involvement? How direct are you seeing their fingers as far as controlling the federal and state machinations, for want of a better word?
I think it's 100%. So I just think if you look at any government plan and then you look to find the United Nations plan, it will be a plan or a policy or an agreement that Australia signed up to. I don't know what year that all started and became as much as it is, but there's no hiding it. It's not a conspiracy, even though they keep pretending it is. It's like their plans in Australia are called the same plans, and in the plans in Australia they refer to, we agreed to this at this conference, or we are using this plan from the United Nations. So this is the thing that, I mean, the United Nations SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, so they're 17 and they're like zero hunger, and, you know, and they're not on the surface level, you wouldn't disagree with them. You would say, yep, I would like to see zero hunger in the whole world. But, you know, if I consider, like, I've been looking a lot at food and what's happening with our food sources, and the United Nations formed, so they've got the Food and Agricultural Organization. They formed a partnership with CropLife in 2021 to transform the global food systems. Now, CropLife is Bayer Monsanto and Syngenta and Corteva, who own the seed stocks, you know, the vast majority of seed stock in the world now. And there's many government, many United Nations documents talking about it's going to need to be synthetic food. So to save the climate and to feed the world, that means that food has to be patented and centrally controlled and as far away from natural as you can get. So there's just, if you look at it, it's just corporate capture, and it's very disturbing.
So in our particular shire, we're 3,500 square kilometres, and we have pretty much a dichotomy of communities whereby we've got the coastal strip, which is all of us present here tonight, with the ocean's about 150 metres that way. Be 110 metres tomorrow because, of course, the ocean's coming. But we also have the other half, if you like, of our community is slightly more inland. 100 kilometres inland is our inland border sort of thing. And they're all farming. And I had someone say to me the other day, and it almost, I wouldn't say it broke my heart, but I found it very concerning. He said, I don't want my rates being spent to protect the house of some millionaire with their oceanfront property. I want those guys to maybe draw some threads from what you've been telling us today to see that they're coming for you guys next. And it needs to be an all-of-community approach rather than us versus them, or, well, not in my backyard, doesn't affect me.
Yeah, it's exactly. Well, it's starting with erosion, you know, and coastal erosion and flooding. That seems to be the bigger one. I mean, maybe Western Australia's different, but in our area, but it'll be bushfires, it'll be anything. There is a climate map so if you look up Climate Council of Australia, there's a climate map for Australia, and you can put in your town and it'll tell you how much they assess. Like where I live is like 95% high risk or something because of bushfire, so you're not protected anywhere. If you're near nature in any way, shape or form, you're not protected. And what happens over and over again is that people are pitted against each other as the problem. And, if it wasn't for this group over there, we wouldn't be having these issues. It's not the case. This is something that's bigger than that, and people need to understand it. And, with climate change, I haven't done all the reading yet because it would take me a long time to get my head around climate change and how this has all come about and the modelling. But I do know Rockefeller's had a very big part in creating the narrative around climate change or human-induced climate change. And I'm just to preface that I do a lot about the environment. I fought really, really hard around pesticides and chemicals being sprayed through the environment. Try to keep things as natural as possible. So there's been a shifting of the narrative around climate change. But what I can say is that the things they're talking about under the guise of climate change, like solar radiation mediation to stop the sunlight coming through and to pump stuff into the atmosphere, which they are talking about very much, or synthetic food, or synthetically altering trees, which is also what they want to do, synthetically altering root systems to draw down more carbon. We are living under the guise of climate change. They are creating a synthetic nightmare. And that's what I can say with complete assurance.
And this is obviously part of this is why we're seeing our farmers being forced off their land and ridiculously low prices being offered, and banks not coming in to save where maybe they would because there's big corporations off to the side. Interesting fact, I don't know, came out a couple of weeks ago, was that more than half, 64% of all residential properties in America last year were purchased by BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, so investment companies. So more than half of all residential properties sold in the country last year was to these big investment companies. The whole idea is this: if you don't believe me, now that the World Economic Forum has been ratified as the official financial arm of the United Nations, I encourage you all to go and read The Great Reset, which is a book written by Klaus Schwab, who is the guy who's the head of the World Economic Forum. And you want to understand what all this stuff is going on and what they're trying to achieve, read his book, not some interpretation by someone on the internet. Read the book and you will understand why I'm so concerned and why I go to the effort to sort of bring some of this information to you. Kate, before I throw the floor open, I just want to ask you one question. I jotted down as we're going along. There's all this talk about modelling. There's all this talk about when, and predicted, not when we reach a break point, but if we predict that you're going to be inundated, you're going to have to go. Did you see anywhere throughout any of the legislation any plans to walk back any of these powers when and if those models are proven again to be totally inaccurate?
No, they don't have to be right. They make it very clear that it's unknown what's going to happen, and they give themselves this really, really uncomfortable, which I talked about a number of times. It's just like it can increase. So it can start off incrementally, but everything's going to get worse. They make that very clear. Everything's going to get worse. So it might start with, one area, but now, 10 years later, we've got to intensify it. So I think it's just going to go into more and more intensifying. There is no obligation for them to be right or that you get your land back or anything. There's nothing there. I just quickly wanted to say, when you were talking about the housing as well, New South Wales government and I think it's the federal government as well, have made it much easier, and there's huge kickbacks to build build to rent buildings. So nobody can ever buy them. You are a renter for your whole life. And Blackstone is coming into Australia, and Blackstone is the largest real estate owner of real estate in America. So we're looking at private ownership becoming incredibly difficult. And there's a lot of vitriol towards mum and dad investors who have one rental home. The amount of vitriol that's put through the media, et cetera, is horrendous. But nobody's talking about we're going to be in a paradigm in a culture of renting from massive corporations like Blackstone.
So a quote from that book, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab: by 2030, you will own nothing and you will be happy. That's his dream. Now, that's a direct quote from the head of the World Economic Forum. the plan is that you want a toaster, go hire one from the government. A kettle, a car, you own nothing, but you'll be happy because you don't have the stress of having to worry about having things. Of course, it also means that your digital ID and your digital currency may get switched off if you don't comply with other rules. So I'm going to throw the floor open. Is anyone here present that has a question I'd like to ask Kate? You can even come up and get on the camera if you want. She's been very thorough, and so obviously Mike Cram, who's been heavily involved with trying to rattle the cages on a local level to get some answers to some of these questions, which our Shire councillors, our Shire president, openly admitted at a recent special meeting for electors that he's got no idea what managed retreat looks like or what it means. So we're being asked to implement plans and strategies which refer to operations which we don't have a full concept of, and I can't see that with an open conscience we can possibly proceed down that track. But Mike says there's no evidence of mean sea level rise in WA for 107 years of records using buoys. That's obviously the means level, meaning ignoring land subsidence, because the Bureau actually has their laser guided GPS tracked measuring devices. So if the land is subsiding, it actually knows that the machine is lower. So in 107 years, less than 1 millimetre between 1980 and 2022 along this stretch of our coast. And so even though there's been less than, I think it's 1.3 millimetres at Hillary's, over that time period, there's still creating our adjusted figures on an assumed 8 millimetres per year sea level rise, even though we've had 1.3 millimetres or 1.4 millimetres in the last 30 odd years. Are you seeing that dichotomy of information? I know you said there's different models you can use depending on which outcome you want, and I've seen that firsthand on multiple occasions where, you know, there's that old saying. In fact, our esteemed Commodore who's here made the comment that an engineering report will usually conclude whatever the person who paid the engineers to do the report wanted them to conclude. How obvious is that becoming, that there's different applications of the models to suit the narrative of whichever local government entity is trying to achieve?
Yeah, I know that in Kapiti they fought back against it because, you know, people have lived there for a long time and not seeing any sea rise at all. So they've really fought back against that. And they said in their report, so I can't remember the name, Jacob's report, which was put out about how, you know, Kapiti wasn't a good place to be able to keep living. They said like a lot of information in there was wrong. It wasn't specific to Kapiti. You know, it didn't take into account certain things that naturally mitigated the risks that they were talking about. So I think when it does, we don't have it yet in our area, so I can't talk about, you know, having to hone down. But it's really crucial when it does that people actually start to challenge and really look through and see, is this right? Don't just take it on face value. Really get into it, because you know your actual town better than you know, how it's being talked about in the plans. But also I think even my presentation tonight, which is real, I mean, I have spent hundreds of hours, I have over, you know, this year I've spent hundreds of hours looking at documents. But I don't think there'd be many even mayors or councillors or whatever, or people working for council that would know what I've shown you tonight.
No, and in fact, we've got a couple of our councillors tuned in on the Zoom meeting, and in fact, Frank, our most popular councillor, is at the bar. So it's great that they're getting engaged as well. And I think from discussion with the other councillors, I think they really are starting to understand the depth and the implications, and therefore we should be chucking on a big handbrake and looking into this further before going any further down the track of making these plans. Have you found, as is sometimes the case with government oversight, that there's requirements within the legislation that once you ask for assistance or put your hand up or have a disaster plan, you've now admitted that we're a disaster area and therefore now we're incumbent to be part of that legislation?
No,
So
I don't. No, I don't know.
or is it just across the board?
I don't know. Well, they are. I mean, the state government's for New South Wales is going to make every local council make a disaster adaptation plan. So we are going to be all part of it in New South Wales. And I'm sure, I don't think they're going to allow one state or territory in Australia to get away with not being part of it. you know, so it will be there as well. So it'll be rolled out that the council has to do this. And basically the Reconstruction Authority it reads to me like the Reconstruction Authority is just going to give it to the local council. But they also do talk about in that document from New South Wales State Government, it'll be more like, I think they'll amalgamate or put the region together. So so this is another thing they do is they make the areas wider and wider and bigger. So it becomes much harder for people to have a say. Like it sounds like in your local council area, you've got enough people that are community members that can actually get up and become councillors, you know, independent councillors, where I am in the Central Coast, where they amalgamated two big local government areas together, and then they're bringing in huge population. It's going to become impossible I think very difficult for the local community to come together and actually fight something. So I think in the smaller towns, you might have a better option unless they amalgamate a whole bunch of councils together and then roll it out that way.
Very interesting. So, yes, Frank Peschke is one of our local councillors, and he's been sitting patiently waiting to ask a question. I'm going to try and defy technology and turn the laptop around so that you can see Frank. So we may lose you momentarily if my cables come unstuck. Is the mic on there, Frank?
Thanks, Kate, for the presentation, and Joseph for the coordination. Thank you to the people who come here tonight. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to ask Kate a more localised question on the information that she's given tonight. Is going back to property rights and individual rights, where you're basically saying that the state government will force people off their land, force them to demolish their own property once trigger point. And who determines those trigger points, whether that's a community engagement one, or is it driven by bureaucracy, and then bureaucracy dictates what happens and doesn't happen to your property, and there's no value left. We're legally around Australia or anywhere in New South Wales, does anyone interpret the law to see what rights are left with the property owner, or is there a fading light on that one?
Did you ask, I'm finding it a little hard to hear. Did you ask, has anyone challenged it yet?
Or challenged it, but is there a challenge, or there's an absolute decree that property owners have got no rights to their property end of the day, no matter what's in front of them? They've been forced off their land, they've got to demolish their own house, clean up their own property at their own cost, then go and build somewhere at their own cost. Federal government are not offering any compensation, states not, state giving it down to local government can't afford it. The poor humble property owner sits there paying all these rates and then get told to get off the land.
Yeah, well, the policy's not going to come out till mid next. I think it's definitely next year. I think it might be mid next year around the policies for managed retreat. I imagine that there'll be some reimbursement for people's property, but the thing that I want to talk, really say is they do talk about moving communities together, which means that why would you move? Yeah, I'm actually, and if they're talking about widespread managed retreats, you've got a lot of people to move. Who's going to pay for it? So are you going to be moved into a smart city, basically, a smart complex where it's going to be resilient? I mean, you've got to look at this word resilient. What are they considering resilient? Resilience is about having a lot of digital infrastructure and, really packing and stacking people together. That's what they're considering is resilient, probably away from nature. So I think it hasn't happened yet, basically.
Isn't resilience depending on your own livelihood and your own property as well, in that broad sense and definition, versus going to a smart city and get locked up in grey blocks of buildings? And yeah, you might have security because you've got 10 square metres of property, and you might be 15 minutes away from a shopping centre with a digital card. But end of the day, people should have own rights, and being resilient to stay and adapt to that, and have that resilience to stay and adapt. Surely that's what I'm getting back to, the rights of property owners, the legal right to have their property rather than be forced off their property. Is there anything in legislation at the minute, or is it in around Australia that's through your research that indicates this is going to be squashed and Big Brother's going to kill us off?
Is there any what?
Is there any information or research that you've done around Australia that's got Big Brother, either federal or state governments, or there's multinational corporations are going to kick people off their property that they own and got title deeds to, and be forced off their property without no compensation.
I don't know. I don't know if there'll be no compensation. That's the thing I'm not sure about. I think it's going to be, but it's going to be really like, I mean, even if you look at those energy ratings that they're going to put on people's homes, and I think you're going to have 7 stars out of 10, and it's massive. And I will write about this. So if you're interested, please do go to my Substack, and I will have something up in another week because I only looked at it this morning. So even that, like, what are people? So you've got the climate overlays over houses. You've got people, you know, your house is going to come with a certificate saying it's climate risks. You're going to have inability for people to buy, to pay the insurance on the house. And then if you try and sell it and you don't have a good enough star rating, you know, what's the cost going to be like for that? So basically they're going to basically demolish the house price. That's what's going to happen. So your houses are not going to be worth very much. And then it'll be easy to be bought out. I imagine there'll be some compensation, but I doubt it'll be very much. It might be enough to get yourself into like a 1-bedroom. I don't know. I'm just, you know, thinking, but there's no way they can pay out everyone properly. The other thing they're going to do with this climate, these ratings, is that they're going through the banking system as well. So if you've got a mortgage on your house, you're going to be forced to upgrade and do different things as well to keep your mortgage. So it's all very nasty, and it's all coming down the pipeline. I reckon in the next couple of years, it's going to all hit at the same time, and a lot of people are going to be forced out of home ownership. That's my pessimistic view of how people are already struggling. How are they going to pay for extra things? Plus, you've got the digital revolution where they talk very much about people are going to be out of work and replaced by AI and machines and robotics and stuff like that. So we're going to be more and more in gig economy as workers, and then need a universal basic income. So we're heading into a very difficult future, which is, it's very transparent if you read the documents, what they're talking about.
Thanks, Kate. I will declare I'm a property owner and a business owner, as well as a councillor at the local Shire of Gingin. Just to let you know that background, but I encourage people to ask some questions, please. Thank you, Kate.
You even got a bark of approval. Even got a bark of approval there from the local hounds. So there's another question I'd like to ask Kate directly, remembering, of course, if you do think of things afterwards, we'll be able to funnel on some questions. And of course, Kate does have a very comprehensive list of all the associated documents so that you can go and cross-reference them for yourself. And as I try to look for people who obviously know more about these things than I do, which I think is definitely the responsibility of a councillor, but also the responsibility of yourselves as residents, ratepayers, and people who live and love and spend your lives in the area. We have Mike Cram. He's a reformed almost, and he's a retired lawyer, so he might get a bit wordy, but we'll see how we go.
Hello, Kate.
Hello.
Hello. Look, congratulations on everything you've done. I think we recognise you as the foremost expert in Australia in this madness. You know, the whole issue is like a really bad set pudding. It's like a blancmange. It's kind of neither here nor there, but you know, and we are kind of simple folks who live on the coast of West Australia. We're sort of looking for the silver bullet. Is there a silver bullet? I mean, how do we influence states and local government, and how do we get any advocacy together so that gets us a uniform, you know, and meaningful, you know, front against this madness?
So Capity has a couple of groups that formed, one that had been around for a while called the Capity Ratepayers Association, I think it's called. And that formed, and they did that was, I can't remember what it was, but it was a climate model that was going to impact on the property prices in Capity in about 2014 or around that time. And they did a successful court case. And then you've got Capity Calm, so CALM, who formed a bunch of women. I think they seem to be all women, the ones I've spoken to, and they letterbox drop and they get the community organized, and they've got a lot of community traction through pushing back around what's going to happen or what's in the works for Capity. So I just think there needs to be, if you live in a community where people are connected to each other and actually, you know, are concerned about this, I do think, and you've got a couple of councillors on board, it's just worth the fight. It's worth the fight locally to take it on.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, but unfortunately, as Jason has pointed out and you've pointed out, that the local councils are captive to the state policy, and in Western Australia, it's state planning policy 2.6, and yeah, that's captive to, you know, a federal policy, which is captive to a global policy.
Yep.
And you know, I almost think that our councillors are in a squeeze. They don't have you know, the ammunition or the ability to fight back against this. So how can we help them?
Yeah, I think it's I know it's really, I don't have any answers. I guess that's one of my issues, is that I spend all my time doing the research, and I don't have answers as to how to get around this. It is so intense, and things have been in the works for a long time. You know, their plans have been in action for a long time. They've been formulated, and now they're being rolled out, and we're getting hit by all sides of this. There's so many plans that are being unrolled upon us all at the same time with massive implications. And it's like, I can't keep up with the Australian plans and the legislation that's coming out. So I'm not 100% sure. I really hope that we can find ways to, you know, come together enough to even slow it down, I guess. But I can't say I've got answers. I'm hoping somebody else comes up with some answers.
We need people like you to raise the questions in the first place, Kate. That's exactly what you're doing. So well done. Any other questions from the crowd? We've got some very esteemed local members of the community here, but they seem to be quietly contemplating. Commodore, you had a bit to say before, mate? Yeah. Pete? No? So, all right, you have to see my ugly face again, that'll teach you. So, Kate, look, at this point, I think, well, first of all, if everyone would like to join me in a round of applause to take Kate for another. I did tell Kate the other day I was very proud of her and very grateful on behalf of all Australians for the work that she's doing. It's very selfless. She hasn't got sponsors and corporations and things supporting her. She's just a person with a conscience and an inquiring mind who's putting in a lot of legwork so that we can skim through. Mike's got another one for you. Sorry?
Thanks, Jason.
Don't have to be on camera, but here you go.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, I had a question just from the floor here. Has there been a situation where the community has persuaded the council to reverse managed retreat back to protect and accommodate? And how did they do it?
Yeah, well, this is interesting. So remember when I started, I was talking about, I can't remember the name of the town now, but it's in Wales. And so that was put on the thing that that was back in 2013. So that was going to be having to have managed retreat. Somehow 10 years later, the council's backtracking and saying, no, we never said that, even though, you know, the townspeople, according to the newspaper articles, are saying, yep, that was exactly what was said. So for whatever reason in that area where the people, and it sounds like they were an obstinate community who wasn't going to go along with it, the council's shape shifted, whether or not they've done that for a nefarious reason because there's another way they're going to approach it, I cannot say. I don't know. I think there's a whole bunch that could be really, so I've only got to where I can get to. And every time I look at something, it could spiral out to be, there's so much to learn and understand. But I think it'd be really interesting to see where certain areas have been already had managed retreat. Did the people actually want this? I mean, has this been happening? Is it happening in Africa? You know, what other countries around the world, and under what conditions have people been moved? I think it would be an excellent research thing to see how this has been playing out. But it's also very new in terms of this being widespread. They're talking about it just being very new. It hasn't happened that much according to what I can see. And of course, there'd be areas where it would have been really stupid to build on a certain area where it does get flooded all the time, or it's, you know, like it is a problematic area where you would think, okay, it's better to move people because that should never have been built on, or because government's changed its practices, so maybe damming something or undamming something, that it becomes problematic, which, you know, needs to be taken into consideration into what happens in our natural environment. I'm rambling a little bit, it's getting quite late here, but basically it's pretty new to do this widespread managed retreat based on climate change modelling, as far as I can understand.
Thank you.
But if we can get them, I guess why I've done this and done all this much research, because the government and the newspapers and the media, they bring things out incrementally and they sort of soften people up. They soften people up to accept it. So my whole thing has been, I want to understand what's happening and I want to let people know before they've been indoctrinated. So they might have a natural response to this rather than the fear campaigns and the narrative being sort of meaning that you end up going, oh, there's nothing. Yes, of course, because I think we need sharp minds and we need to investigate everything we're looking at and to see whether or not we're comfortable with it. Do we trust it? And do we look at who's backing it financially and who's going to profit and where's the infrastructure going to go to and whose hands? Because yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do, is to alert people before it's normalized.
Can I ask you just one more question? And I really appreciate the time that you've put in, and I know what time it is in New South Wales. We have a 2,000-3,000 kilometre coastline. We have several shires up and down that coastline. All of the shires have gone for a protect and accommodate. They are building groins, they're doing seawalls, whatever, etc. Our shire has gone for a managed retreat. What is the sense of uniformity across the New South Wales coastline about their adaptation plans and how they managed to conform to a single point of view about this?
They haven't come up with anything yet in New South Wales, except for the coastal management plans might be, because they're all being worked on at the moment, but I'm not so clear about those ones. But I do know that I was reading, you know, the southern coast, so around Ulladulla area, and they were talking in one of the documents about smaller towns. So smaller towns where there's only one road in, one road out are seen as much more problematic. So I think it'll be the smaller towns that are
That's us.
yeah, ticked off. It's easier. There's not as many of you in terms of moving people. And yeah, so they've really made the case for that area, that because there was only one town in and out, one road in and one road out, that it's not resilient and it doesn't have the amount of resources around it, you know, the shopping centres and everything else. So this again links into the urbanisation of people.
We have some sand dunes that are valuable as well, so we might be able to suck up a bit more of those if we're all gone. Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Cheers.
Right, thank you.
He wasn't allowed to drink in the courtroom, thankfully. So,
Okay.
But yeah, again, so anyone, or can we let Kate go get some sleep? No, I think we've seen some very happy faces, well, some concerned faces as well, Kate. Obviously, this wasn't an entertainment session. But look, I really greatly appreciate you taking the time to have a chat with us directly, and I'll share this recording on my Facebook page and whatnot. Is it okay to make this available for everybody to see
Yeah.
the video on YouTube, so I can share the links for those non-Facebookians? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's good. I really want as many people as possible to be aware. So thank you for inviting me on to talk to you. It's very good to be able to talk to councillors and local communities. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing how you go, and, you know, hopefully you'll find some way of being able to maneuver around this. So yeah, we are, you know, that cliche, we are actually all in this together. So yeah, appreciate it.
I think just by understanding a few of the terms a little bit better, and especially how some words which we think we know what they mean have been redefined,
They've been redefined. Yeah.
I think it will help us to frame our own. We've already have a churn map in place. We're a little bit ahead of the curve. We already have one in place, but we're looking to update it. So, which is where the conversation has commenced from. I think this gives us an opportunity to engage as a community and strongly define our terms of what our words mean and what is required of a local government authority who we give money to provide us facilities, security within our homes. So thank you very much, Kate. I'm going to keep chatting with this lot here, but I think we'll let you go. Round of applause for celebrity status and the dog's giving a double bark. So we'd really love to catch up with you again soon. And certainly, is it okay to share the links, obviously, to your Substack and so on? So
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah, that's good.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Hang on, turn around so I can say goodbye. There we go. So is that
All right. See ya.
Thanks very much, Kate. Talk soon.